Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brenda Schertz, and I'm the ASL Program Coordinator at Cornell University. And it is such an honor to introduce Dr. Keith Gamache, Jr. to our ASL lecture series. Our ASL lecture series intends to bring in a diverse group of individuals with a diverse ranging topics about ASL. I've met Keith at various conferences and seen his work and his brief production of IF with DVD work that still stands in our community. It's an honor to introduce him as our speaker for today's session. Keith has taught for more than 25 years, and his PhD is from Gallaudet University in ASL to English interpretation, with a focus on interpreting and deaf and hard of hearing ASL fluency. Keith has an ASL TA proficient certification, as well as a CDI certification. He is currently an ASL professor and an ASL program coordinator at Irvine Valley College in Irvine, California. His presentation today will be from whole to parts, with a focus on ASL discourse analysis. Keith, the floor is yours. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So I got my slides here, and as you can see, from whole to parts is the objective of our presentation today. And as you can see, the imagery of puzzle pieces, and I myself personally love puzzles, and it's so intriguing to see puzzle pieces coming together to portray such a beautiful picture. And we'll be looking at the parallels with ASL linguistics. And, the more I watch people use language within the community, knowing its rules and structures, without upholding all of those rules, but looking at how people use language is such a passion of mine. And I want to make a disclaimer that I honor diversity and backgrounds, and the goal of this presentation is not to portray one side, but just to bring in a range of individuals. And I recognize that the samples provided are from white individuals, but future work will incorporate more BIPOC representation. And I also want to recognize Dr. Elizabeth Winston, who inspired me in my work in this area on discourse analysis and on ASL language as a whole. As I've given various conferences, workshops, and presentations, I've been told that my language use was not representation of ASL, and I've asked, why was it not? And I think in an hour lecture, someone maybe made a comment about one sign choice out of the entire presentation and then said, that was not ASL, which begs the question, what is ASL? Can one sign affect the entire presentation and the use of language? As you can see in this picture, I love movies. And in another workshop and presentation, someone else came up to me and said, I love your signing choices. I actually feel like I'm participating in a movie. I said, well, what would that mean? Someone said, I don't have to work so hard to process what's being said. I can actually just consume the information and actually enjoy it, which got me thinking, is that what ASL should be? Ease of use language from start to finish that brings you like you watched a movie? As I consume social media posts and content, people post blogs, videos in ASL about what you should or shouldn't do. And a lot of it comes down to the sign choices. maybe handshakes, or if you think about even over the last few years, changing initialized signs. And I think that can be counterproductive, because are we talking about ASL? Because we're still using ASL, which again is initialized in some way, but we're defining it and having those discussions. And as you see in this presentation today, we're going to be making some parallels between ASL and English and identifying some of the bias that English might hold. And as we look at different literature, that we can analyze discourse as a whole, but it actually will be broken down at a syntax level. But the syntax component is about how sentences are structured and arranged and how they tie together thoughts. And over the last 5 years, in those particular areas, I haven't seen much discussion. And I've looked at sign language studies journals that have put out articles that have to do with sign language, not just in ASL, but across a wide spectrum of language. And over the last 5 years, in doing some keyword searches, specifically looking at syntax and discourse in ASL, I could only find, over the last 5 years, mind you, a total of 100 different articles. But out of that search, only 2 covered topics of syntax and discourse. So, there's some that have to do with the phonetical structure or how language is used or how to teach ASL, but only 2 articles out of 100 highlighted the discourse and syntax of ASL. And one focused specifically on pronouns, which I thought was very intriguing, and another highlighted the importance of discourse and that it's still not been researched enough. And that was last published 3 years ago. So out of 100 articles, 98 do not mention syntax and discourse. And does that imply that it's not as important, or that the need is there? As an ASLTA member and participating in online workshops and conferences, thinking about how we can best improve our practices for teaching ASL. At the most recent conference, I kept an eye out if there were any topics presented about syntax and discourse, and there were none. I think in the past couple of years, there might have been 1 or 2, but none in this most recent conference. Some food for thought. And then in the infamous Linguistics of American Sign Language book, in taking the latest edition of ASL, I skimmed through to find information about syntax and discourse. And there are a few areas within this book, and again, wanted to highlight specifically what's said from Linguistics of American Sign Language. On the first page of the topic of syntax, all in English to define the syntax of ASL. It actually took me a couple passes to really understand and try to define ASL through the lens of using English. So as I'm straining, reading through this multiple times, I finally noticed that they're comparing the verb to be within an ASL context. I'm not fully sure I agree with this example and description that ASL does not have a to be verb. And so fast forward, presenting some workshops, and I was really bothered by the concept, the pronoun me, which can be used in this descriptive way. And I thought, how do we learn? So the best way to learn is to inquire. So I asked around, and one individual said, this sign for me, I have to add I am. That's the reason for this sign. When you think of I am teeth as an example, so me, teeth, or I am teeth as a distinction, that was what they had explained. And thinking of the verb to be, it's actually a different type of verb because it's an existential verb, which means that it's showing you are a living, breathing thing in the present. How do we compare 2 different modalities where English is looking at a written form and ASL is looking at an oral visual form. And we have two completely different modalities that we're apparently trying to compare, which I said, I'm Keith. You can see that I'm referring to myself. I exist in the present, in the here and now in front of you. That can take on the form. But if you're writing it in written form, you don't know where I am necessarily. There's no picture of me on the page. But we do use those comparisons as noted in this example. But then when it said, well, ASL doesn't have the to be form, is that actually true? In this slide, I have some basic sentence types that we'll look at. And we're still creating conversations at a basic sentence level. Where are we in elevating the level of discussion over our language? So let me give you an example. As going back to the 4th edition, there were some references, the infamous green books from 41 years ago now. And we're still using that as a source. And there's not been any current research. Have we elevated the way we talk about our language? And looking at the authors, we have 2 hearing individuals. We need more deaf authors who can actually visualize how to explain these concepts. Another article is about syntax. And I thought, okay, well, this might be a little bit further along than the discourse piece, but again, it's written by a hearing person, which isn't the root of a problem, but it's that this person said it was okay, but I don't know their sign language ability because they clearly have literacy skills to be able to convey these thoughts, but does their fluency of ASL match the level of understanding of how they can explain these concepts in English? For this author wasn't able to explain these concepts in ASL. It was all done in spoken English through an interpreter. So is this our current situation today where we would allow people to talk about our language in spoken English without portrayal in ASL? So a lot of what we would attribute as linguists don't actually put out ASL videos. Maybe it's all rooted in an English structure. And I've been struggling with that, to be honest.
So with that dissatisfaction, I wanted to find some supplemental information. I didn't like that we relied heavily on English to understand ASL syntax. And so I have a collective of supplemental articles that I took a look at and was able to extract some information from. One of them being Dr. Ben Bahan and also Melanie Metzger. And so I felt that they had an important contribution to this topic. So go ahead and take a read on the slide for a moment. And I have to say that I agree. Why are we doing what we're doing? I would have to guess that it might be because we don't fully understand. Well, let me see. I think there are 2 camps of theory. There are some individuals who absolutely can research, but do they fully understand ASL linguistics and all of its components? And then we have another camp where we have individuals who can research, but maybe they can't express that language. And so we really need to combine those 2 areas. We need research, but we need capable and competent individuals as well, not people who will do it in isolation or do it without the proper resources. So what does ASL syntax mean? What is it? What is it not? I have some examples that we'll take a look at together. And I looked on the internet and really I tried to pull what I could from the open source, but, and again, I don't want to be negative about anything that these people, the work that they produce, but these are the examples I was able to find online. This is a 30-second clip, and I'll go ahead and play. And the captions are saying, I'm not an ASL teacher, I'm just a deaf girl with an endeavor to teach individuals ASL through social media. Okay, let's start with the simple basics of ASL grammar. ASL is not English on the hands. You can sign English exactly in the English grammar order, word by word, but that is not true ASL. Okay, so interesting sentiment. So her description doesn't really actually have any definition. She just kind of gives some examples. Sometimes it's easier to give examples than actually to give rationale or explanation as to how that thing is defined or came to be. Thinking about her example, how would we define ASL syntax? And then she went by doing so, explaining the opposite of English. And is that it? Is that true enough? Is ASL just sort of the opposite of English or working in conjunction or function with English? Let's take another look at another video. Sign language grammar is varied. There is no standard, common, one true pure ASL. To be honest with you, there is no deaf person that exists who can sign the purest and truest ASL. Perhaps they are a strong signer, a strong ASL user. But what people call true ASL is not actually something that is reflected in the community as possible.
So I do agree there's a wide variation in the language. Why is that? Do we have formal ASL instruction for deaf children? Do we have deaf adults as role models? It's rare. Of course, they exist, but it's sparse. And again, when we think about English, students take English all through their K through 12 career. They take it year after year consecutively, and even in college, they'll take college-related courses, English-related college courses. And so it's constantly expanding their English comprehension and literacy and understanding, but we don't give that same credit and respect to ASL and allow people to have formal ASL instruction.
So he mentioned something about true or pure ASL. There's not anyone that signs that. And I challenge that statement. I wonder, what exactly does he mean by pure or true ASL? Does it mean that we break away from English 100% and that we have no intrusions? Or does it mean, how do we measure it exactly? So that's something to consider. I love Shakespeare personally, so you know Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. So to ASL or to not ASL, that is the question. And what exactly does that mean? What does it mean when we say that? You know, I'm an individual that grew up signing, and I did notice I would have to code switch. It depended on my audience, it depended on who I was interacting with, and that takes practice and time and effort. I became an ASL interpreter, instructor and researcher, and I still often face these questions.
Is there ever a time that you stop learning and become a complete expert? And I have to say, no, really, we only know a little bit about the language, and there's so much more to learn. And, you know, why not have a PhD in ASL? There are PhDs in other languages and other linguistics. And so why don't we have that for ASL? Something to consider. All right, so I bring one example to you. Often I give workshops and I travel, frequently talking about the topic of syntax, and I'm often challenged. People will ask if the subject-verb-object syntax order is okay and allowed in ASL. Many times you hear the answer no, that it belongs to English. And I challenge that. And I have one video that I'll show you, produced from a school, a deaf school. And this was very recent. They just did this year. And it has to do with subject-verb-object order. English word order tends to follow subject-verb-object, SVO, whereas ASL grammatical structure is object-subject-verb, OSV. And Keith's saying, do you agree with that? Because I'd like to challenge it. Does English feel like they own the subject-verb-object order? Because it's not only English that follows that word order. Other languages do as well. And so sometimes we might look at it as we don't want to be like English, so we avoid that. And we flip the word order around maybe just to make a point. But what is the point? The point is comprehension. And so it needs to make sense to be comprehensible. And what does that mean exactly? Now I'm going to give you another example. This is one of me signing. Let's take a look. Keith, me. Deaf, me. ASL here, INC, I teach. Rudy, my boss. Week 40, 50 hours, I work. Past high school, French, I studied. Watch TV, I like. Paper grading, I don't like. Go to Rochester, I plan. So now that we've looked at that example, let's take a look at our second example. Hi, I'm Keith. I'm deaf. I teach sign language here at INC. My boss is Rudy. I work about 40 or 50 hours a week. Back in high school, I studied French. I like to watch TV. I don't like to grade papers. And in the future, I would like to go to Rochester and visit.
Which sample did you like better, the first sample or the second? I tend to do this, ask this in some of my workshops, and I get some interesting answers. Typically, people say that they like the second sample. And that I use subject, verb, object order. Now, it seems, though, that we have a lot of assumptions. We have more assumptions than we do proof. And we can't always necessarily back things with our data. And so in terms of elevating and advancing, we need data. We need data-driven evidence. We need to understand where these ideas come from, where these laws, these rules about the language come from. And we need to work together collaboratively. All of the advances going forward as well. So more on the subject, verb, object topic. Thinking about a model signer would be someone who's very competent in the language and very skilled.
And someone who can safely represent this, I think, is MJ Bienvenue. She has a strong fund of knowledge with sign. She's a strong signer. She went to Gallaudet, studied at Gallaudet for many years. And so she knows her stuff. And she's been in hot discussions over this topic. And so we're going to take a look at that. And her video is called ASL Know-How. It's about 6 minutes long, but I won't show the full 6 minutes. I'll just show the first 30 seconds where she gets right to the point. MJ. Hello. I'm going to share some of my thoughts on sign language. More and more, I've noticed people inventing signs that they call pure or clean ASL. And I look at them puzzled. What exactly does that mean? I think the language is just fine. What's pure ASL? Do we have to invent signs and then go back and change signs? So I've been polling some of my friends and they don't really like that concept and I don't like that idea either and I've been a bit resistant to it. Keith. So this is the first 30 seconds of the video. How many sentences did you notice? Did you notice which word order she used? SVO, OSV? So right now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a breakdown of 5 different utterances. Not full sentences, but I'm using the word, a linguistics term, utterances. Sentence, I know that we use that word pretty interchangeably, but in sign, it's a little bit different. We have different rules compared to English. So if you remember when I mentioned modality, when we think about starting and ending a sentence, of course, it's not an exact science. The word order, the length, it's not a perfect science. We don't have a handbook that we follow on how to construct sentences. I think perhaps it's something that we could develop. But this idea of topic shift is also involved in linguistic studies and involved in sentence structure construction. Again, when we go back to MJ's video, I notice 5 particular utterances. Let's take a look at the first.
Hello. I'd like to share my thoughts about signs. And so again, I'm breaking this same video up into a first utterance. Why did I cut it here? Because there's a pause. You see how she brought her hands down? This is a non-manual signal to indicate that this thought is complete, and she's now going on to the next point. So that's one indicator. There's another way that her body posture is set back a little bit. So there are two indicators that that thought is complete. In this first utterance, looking at either object, subject, verb, or SVO, I wanted to highlight one thing. So let me back up here. She starts out with a greeting, an exclamation. And looking at this structure in this order, this is what it would actually look like. It's subject, verb, object. So let's go on to the next utterance. It's as I've seen more and more people are breaking apart ASL and looking at more of a pure way of defining ASL. So how did I know to stop this utterance here? There was a slight pause, a time delay where she then moved on to another thought. And so what was included here, let me break this down even more. She presents us a subject. She doesn't use an object to start. There's a lot of verbs and conjunctions. So instead of just being a subject verb object, it's subject verb 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 object. So, but it still follows the same SVO structure. So there are 5 utterances that I'm breaking apart. So now we'll go on to the third utterance. As I'm watching all the videos, I'm thinking, what's wrong with ASL that exists now? Do we have to come up with something? Are we reverting back in time? I'm really puzzled. So in this utterance, I look at this as a sandwich sentence. And we haven't really spent a lot of time discussing this. She says, I was really puzzled at something. She provides her content and context and then closes it with the same reflection. I'm really puzzled. So that's a sandwich, for lack of a better word, type sentence to show a complete thought. And in this utterance, I think this is the most complicated one than the other few that I gave in this example. And I'll show you why. So there's a lot more signs that were produced. And again, as you can see, which sentence structure we follow. Even though we've made it more complex, it still follows a subject verb object, or we could also look at it as this. It's really interesting because in this utterance, there are 8 verbs used, 8 actions, 4 that relate with nouns. I think this is really interesting. We can identify, is this a basic sentence structure? No, this is obviously a lot more complicated. So where are the discussions circulating this topic? So, but again, this follows a subject verb object. So now under the 4th utterance, so I've asked around to friends and they didn't like this idea. It's the same as what I'm thinking. Well, let me back up. The way I took that as an indication for a complete utterance, she uses raised eyebrows to indicate that she's going to go on to a new topic. And in this sentence, we have subject, verb, verb, noun, which is the object, determiner, and then a pronoun. So there's a little bit more here that makes it a complex sentence, but still follows subject, verb, object, word order. So we're on the 4th utterance with 4 out of 5 in subject, verb, object. Now onto the last one. I'm resistant to that. So this was object, subject, verb. So out of these 5 examples, the 5th one we get to an OSV object. This is something that I'm resisting as an utterance. And so she had in ASL, based on this example, there are both types of sentences. In fact, 4 out of the 5 are subject, verb, object. And the statistics is showing us that maybe 80% are subject, verb, object, word order. So we can't think about it applying to all types of sentences. We need to have ways to replicate this. So again, this is one example. Now let's take a look at some other ones. Are they following similar patterns? And the more we bring in that data, the more of a stronger case we can make. But again, the reason why we're talking about this is we're still coming at it from a lens of looking at English. Is it coming from our attitudes towards English? Is it coming from our bias? Do we have a healthy perspective on English itself? Why are we so set on doing everything that revolves around an English structure? This next part of my presentation focuses on fingerspelling. I remember going to the ASLTA conference back in 2009 out in Arizona, and the opening remarks were provided by Dr. Carol Padden. And she talks about fingerspelling in her work. And at the time, I actually didn't notice a lot of tension or discussion over eliminating the use of fingerspelling in discourse. So thinking about the letter R, for example, when we look at something that is set up in English, we look at maybe the outline of the letter R and how that's shaped in ASL. We can say, well, where are the similarities on how a visual language is represented in a written language? So, for example, the iconic picture of R actually follows maybe English visual representation. Are we allowed to borrow from English? Are there conversations that permit that? The ABCs, as an example, isn't actually based on English. It's actually a Phoenician script where it was used by the Italians, the Romans. It was used all throughout history with this type of script. And now we're saying, well, ASL can't use that. Well, every time we talk about ASL, we're using the letters ASL, which again, if that's based on English, it kind of defeats the purpose. Well, the conclusion of that is to reduce the amount of fingerspelling. And I've seen that shared by a few individuals and saying, my teachers tell me to reduce the use of fingerspelling. And it's always they, someone out there, kind of like, family circus. Not me, it wasn't my idea. Well, whose idea was it? Oh, it was someone's. We want to think about how we can back up our research with data. Before I continue on, I wanted to share that part of my PhD dissertation work is focused on analyzing what does it mean for fluency as a signer. The ASL PI, the ASL Proficiency interview focuses on assessing your language skills. It comes out of Gallaudet. It's not the only one, but it's a proficiency interview. And I'm using that system in my work. And for a level 3, considered intermediate level, level 4, maybe more advanced, and a level 5 being master. They have a 1 to 5 scale, but 3, 4, and 5 being actual measures of fluency. And I'm going to focus on the upper 3 levels. And wasn't part of my original study, but I discovered this along the way in my research and broke it down into 2 parts. So what exactly is a part of the proficiency exam? And part of the language is, do interpreters have the ability to understand what's being said? And is this clear? So we have to start somewhere. So I broke it down into 3 language features. And you can see on this slide, there are some terms here. One is tokens, which means essentially what you set up in the use of space. Buoys are how we define objects, like classifiers, and then CACDs, after we talk about how we personify or demonstrate action, could be classifiers, but a variety of components. Those 3 features and how they impact the interpreting process. Are there other disruptions that affect the interpreting process? Well, there's absolutely another component, which is fingerspelling. So in this ASL PI exam, I was able to discover the need for discussion around fingerspelling. So in this 5-minute segment, again, it's a sample of work, and there were 10 instances or individuals with a level 3 would fingerspell words maybe 10 times. As you can see, a level 4 would fingerspell almost twice the amount of times at 19, and then a level 5 would fingerspell 40 times within 5 minutes. And I thought the research was saying that the more proficient you are, the less fingerspelling you would use. So again, we're spreading ideas and concepts around, but our data isn't indicating an alignment to those claims. So again, this is from a very small sample. It gives you a quick glimpse into what's possible for continued research. Another distinction that's really worth noting is what makes a really good sample that's produced. And it seems like it could actually, a signer can manipulate their environment. And one quick story is someone might be giving an example or story about the Olympics. And we know that there's me, there's you, there's someone to my left, right, and around me. There are 5 points in the use of space. And they might know exactly what they've identified in that space, to where it's being communicated to the audience, where they can understand exactly what's being said. So I'm thinking in this 30-second clip, they referenced 5 objects in space and were able to continue to reference it and manipulate it within there in that 30-second clip. So we think about how much conversation is being had over the use of space. A lot of opportunity to continue using that. And in the students that I've seen students maybe can produce maybe 1 or 2 uses of space with identifying speakers. Even we see that happening as a common stumbling point, where interpreters are learning to identify 2 speakers with role shifting. So for example, if I go onto the bus with my son and daughter, my son's to my left, my daughter's to my right, I'm talking, facing my left. Where's my daughter? Oh, my daughter's to the left. Well, you didn't say that, but I've identified, even though I'm not saying where my daughter is in that moment, she still hasn't left my right side. So if I'm looking to my left, and I'm talking to my son, I get tapped on my right shoulder. That means my daughter's trying to get my attention. So who am I talking to now? It can be a very confusing concept for emerging signers. And the idea of how we can role shift. I mean, did your son leave? Did he disappear? No. He's still on my left. I'm not pointing any attention to him, but he's still exactly where that is because I set him up in that use of space. So actually learning from emerging signers actually taught me how to better explain these concepts in ASL that are not being talked about. Another distinction that I found really interesting in this study was the use of tokens. And I think this example might make sense for a level 3 user. They used 32 examples of tokens. A level 4 user used 88. But if you look at a level 5 user, they actually used less tokens than a level 4, but more than a level 3. So a token is referring to something in space. Here's a person to my left, somewhere in space. I've identified them, I set them up, that is a token. So then looking at level 4 users, if I said, this person, I might continue to refer to them by adding that descriptor, this person here, but a level 5 would set that person up once and move on. And as soon as they look in that direction, they know they're referring to that exact same person. So we notice that the frequency of what needs to be displayed actually goes down, but they're still set up exactly the same way in space. So you actually get, as you get to mastery, you can use the language in that way, which is actually very fascinating areas to research. In this case study to share, I thought this was really fascinating and shows areas where we might not always think so highly of research-based data. And we look at maybe one area of expertise with one person, and then we might talk to someone else. But the more we bring data together, the more we can look across the board at all the information presented. And our case studies are unfortunately too small. And in two in particular, I wanted to share what I learned from these two particular case studies.
In this first case study, where we compare gender, we look at female and male storytellers reading English text from a book. And we noticed that females tended to have more utterances. And we were wondering if that was the same case in ASL. And when you look at the slide here, you can tell that indeed it is. Now, remember, utterances, again, basically means sentence, but a sign is a word or a concept that is a part of the utterance or the sentence. And so when you compare here, you see that there's 40% more utterances for females and 31% more signs. And for English, they said that it was about 33% more for females, so it's pretty comparable in English and ASL. And so we see that. We, of course, need more than this one study, but in this one study, we do see that reflective here. Another really fascinating area of study is called reference deixis. And this was founded by Dr. Evelyn Hatch. They noticed in their research that discourse as a whole had some common themes. And there were 4 reference points that appeared in discourse, as listed here. And when we look at those and look at ASL, we notice ASL also has these 4 reference points. These are beneficial in leading to clear cohesion and comprehension of a story or of a statement. And if these 4 elements are present, the story is clear and makes a lot of sense. And if they're not, or there are any gaps, then it doesn't make sense. And so you can notice when you compare novice to expert signers, who incorporates these into their signing and who doesn't. And again, we only have one case study with these results. It's limiting. So we do need more. Here are samples from an 8-minute video. You'll recognize that person was referenced often, 57 times. And the story had about 6 different characters, and the characters were transitioned through often, again, 57 times in 8 minutes. Spatial references, there were 11. For example, going into a store, going out for a walk, going around the corner, down the street, home, various different situations. 5 temporal references, morning, afternoon, next week, evening, whatever to indicate time. And it's interesting that we noticed, and I have this experience with interpreters. I was talking to someone and they said last year something happened and then said tomorrow. And so I was asked, last year, tomorrow? Like when, tomorrow last year, when did that occur? There needs to be a marker to indicate a change in time. If you go from one temporal marker to the next, it seems as if you're acting in real time. And so we have to do more diligent research on that as well. Another example, conjunctions. And really, that's the glue between concepts, how concepts merge and align and how they stick together. We use conjunctions. And there's different ways. And ASL has conjunctions as well. And sometimes we have the argument about avoiding the use of conjunctions in ASL, such as for, and, by, so, etc. So the discussion is that it doesn't exist and that we shouldn't use it, but people do still use it actively in the language. So then the conversation becomes, is it allowed? Is it not allowed? So how do we decide? So I have an individual from an 8-minute video who uses this acronym fanboys. That's all of the conjunctions. And you note that there are, in an 8-minute video, 28 different conjunctions used. The one commonly most used was and. Second was but. Oh, I'm not by, but. I might have, I put the wrong word in there on the slide. The second one is but. And then the third most commonly used was so. So, you know, it's used pretty frequently. And these were the top 3 that we found in an 8-minute narrative. And it's fascinating. Conjunctions can come in the beginning of the sentence, the middle of the sentence, and typically you will find them in the middle, but they do start the sentence as well at times. An additive would be in the beginning and then conjunctive in the middle. And we noticed there were 12 additive conjunctions at the beginning and 16 in the middle of the narrative. And so this is an interesting thing to note. I'm wondering also where the non-manual signals are. And of course, there's different rules for NMS. And NMS in and of itself shows cohesion and conjunction in a narrative. So for example, signing mother, daughter. Sometimes it's confusing. Do you mean like the mother herself is a daughter or the mother's daughter? When you sign it in a certain way, in the correct way, it's more clear as to what you're trying to get across. And then finally, at the end, we talked about topic shift, and that came up in one study as well. So again, in the case study, we broke out by gender, male and female. They were curious as to how they shifted topics. If you remember, MJ was talking about rest breaks, that denotes topic shifts, eyebrow raises, head nods or tilts, etc. And so when we look at the top 5 ways that individuals topic shift, you can see the breakdown here. And again, there's different categories. There's different ways to topic shift. And you'll notice between male and female, referring to a person was the most popular for both genders. But then second, we had pausing for female storytellers versus topic comment shifts for male storytellers. And so I think that's pretty interesting because it's just a split second and it can be missed, but that pause can be so short that you don't even know that it's a shift in topic, but it is. And sometimes a pause can be for reflection, right? Thinking about brainstorming, you have an idea that you want to share, and you've got all these thoughts and ideas, floating around in your head, and to really allow the person to have an opportunity for that idea to penetrate and give them a chance to think through. You can also use pause as a way to deliver information, to shift topics, etc. Another way to topic shift is the use of non-manual markers or signals. And we notice frequently for conjunctive use, we use NMS. And so how many times might that occur? We can take a look here at the slide. I love Egypt. I love history, ancient history. And one thing I love is looking at symbols. Architecture, it's called. Lost languages that we don't know how to read, but have been around for many years and at the past were used, we found through archaeological studies. And what we found is they use specific symbols with the intent to denote a certain name or moniker. So it's a symbol that doesn't mean like an animal or whatever you think it might mean. It's actually the pronoun or the formal name of a person. And so I was thinking about how that relates to ASL and how sometimes when we translate, especially during interpreting, it changes ASL itself. And sometimes it's done for their own benefit, and that's an unnatural process, and it changes ASL. So, for example, if I'm reading a book and I just start with the content, someone might say, oh, throw in the topic first. And I would say, why? And they say, well, so the interpreter can follow along. They know what you're talking about, the title, the topic. And so to fingerspell that means that actually you're done. And deaf people never do that. I never see that produced naturally among natural signers. It doesn't feel natural to start with the topic, but we do that for the benefit of the interpreter. So what is important, if you're conversing with deaf individuals, you can rely on their prediction skills, because if they know the topic, they know what you're talking about, they're involved in the conversation, then they will have prediction skills. It's a natural part of using the language. Sometimes I go to a conference and I'll notice people will fingerspell like what comes next. And I think it's interesting. So when they're giving their name, they'll say, my first name, Keith, my last name, Gamache. So they're telling us what comes next. They're not leaving those prediction skills. But if I just walk up and said, my name's Keith Gamache, some people might think it looks like one word when really it's two. And it's just that slightest little pause that expert signers can catch. And they know that it means there's a separation there, that they're actually two words or two names. And so just small pieces of NMS that really have a big part of ASL are something that we need to study more. So looking at MJ's video, there's one part that made me think. And I was wondering, is that what makes us different? You know, what makes skilled signers so skilled and competent? So let's take a look at her narrative here. From a linguistic perspective, the purification of a language is dangerous. It actually kills language. And when we look at the data and we see gatekeeping with language, it's detrimental. We don't want that for ASL, and I doubt that you want that for ASL either. Yeah, so that's one thing that individuals that study linguistics over and over and over again, I tend to see. And I just realized something. We're talking about purifying the language, purification, and she chose to fingerspell the word purification of the language. So is that okay? Is that permissible? Often, for example, in other languages, there's ways to emphasize certain words. And in ASL, we do it by fingerspelling, we do it by body shifting, moving forward, moving backward. For example, if something's very dangerous and I'm cautioning you, I'm going to move forward. So there are rules behind each body movement and non-manual marker. They all have a purpose. They're ingrained in ASL, they serve a purpose, and they help with comprehension. And so again, I think it's important to consider some comparative studies, novice signers versus expert signers, how each of them use the language, what some of the differences are, and some of their movements and non-manual markers, how they use them. And again, we have to focus on ASL and leave English out. It's really important to figure out different questions and find the answers to these questions in ASL. ASL is complex, that's true. The structure, we're still debating. We're still having discussions now, and we need to keep having those discussions. I teach at UND, University of North Dakota, in the ASL program. I'm an ASL instructor to students learning. And my class is required to do one original piece of research. And I had one student, I said, what are you going to study? Do you have any areas of interest, anything that you're curious about with ASL? And they said that they didn't have anything. So I said, are you telling me that you know everything about ASL? And they said, no. Well, you're contradicting yourself then because you don't have any questions, but you don't know everything. So I really think you just don't have the right questions to ask. And as I impressed that on them, they realized that they did need to build on their fund of knowledge because it was really basic. And all of ours is basic. We need more research. We need to focus on ASL, what we already have, what is existing. We have research that we can look at and analyze further. And I think that there are two challenges when we look at doing this. One is that most research is written in English. I admit I have hesitancy when it comes to sitting down and writing because I can articulate everything I want to say beautifully in my natural language. Why do I have to translate to make it understood by hearing individuals who don't understand my natural language? I have to adapt to them and their English standard. So it's just not an equal playing field. Secondly, if you remember the video that talked about all of the different signs and there's no pure signs, when you think about access and who has ASL, do deaf people have access to ASL? And yes, again, K through 12, there are some schools and programs where they teach sign, But a lot of deaf individuals and deaf children don't have access to that because they don't go to residential schools. They're often isolated in the world in mainstream programs without community around them. Some might sign, some might not at all. And so who are their ASL models? Where is ASL for deaf students as a natural language with focus on it to grow the language and linguistic capabilities and the community? How do we bring forth ASL research and make it accessible to the community? So that was my presentation, and I'd like to end now with a poem from NTID's cherished Patrick Graybill. English, English. Learn, forced to learn. Sign language, shackled, chained. Break free. Expand mind. Use sign. Battle, my language, your language. Take a bow. Shake your hand. Peace. Peace among our language, mine and yours.
I look forward to that day. Thank you all so very much. If you're interested in contacting me and continuing the conversation, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.